The Hiya Mind, Breaking Negative Thought Chains with the Discipline of Mental Karate, by David Russo. What if every negative thought didn't have to be obeyed? What if you could interrupt it, not by fighting it with more thinking, but with a decisive mental action, a sharp internal hiya, like a karate chop through wood, not to destroy your thoughts, but to break their automatic power over you? This audiobook is not about fighting your mind, it's about training it. Just like karate teaches discipline through repeated physical movement, you can train your inner world through repeated mental action. Interrupt, cut, and replace. One thought at a time, one hiya at a time, until reaction becomes choice. Introduction, the martial art of the mind. As a martial arts practitioner, I've learned something that isn't obvious from the outside. Karate is never just about physical technique. A punch is never just a punch. A stance is never just a stance. Every movement is a form of training that reaches deeper into attention, discipline, emotional control, and the ability to act with clarity under pressure. The body is simply the doorway. The real training happens in the mind, whether we realize it or not. All of us are already in training every single day. The question is not if we are practicing it, it's what we are practicing. We practice worrying by replaying the same concerns. We practice doubt by questioning ourselves at every step. We practice hesitation by delaying action. We practice avoidance by turning away from discomfort. And just like in martial arts, repetition doesn't just build skill, it builds identity. What you practice consistently, you eventually become. The thoughts you repeat shape the reactions you default to, and those reactions quietly define the direction of your life. This is the invisible training most people never choose consciously, but martial arts teaches a powerful alternative. Repetition can be intentional. It can be directed. It can be mastered. In karate, there is a concept known as the kaya sharp. Focus shout, often heard as hiya. It is not random noise. It is the release of energy, the unification of body and mind, and a moment of total commitment. It marks the exact point where hesitation ends and action begins. In this audiobook, that same principle becomes internal. The Hiya Mind is not about yelling out loud or forcing positivity. It is about creating a decisive mental action, an intentional interruption that cuts through the automatic patterns running beneath your awareness. It is a way to step into the space between thought and reaction and choose your direction instead of being pulled by habit, because most negative thought patterns don't feel like choices. They feel automatic. They arrive quickly, repeat easily, and escalate without permission. One thought leads to another, then another, forming chains that shape emotions, decisions, and behavior before you even notice what's happening. The Hiya Mind breaks that chain, not through force, not through overthinking, but through interruption and redirection, a clear mental cut. This is not about suppressing thoughts or pretending they don't exist. Suppression only strengthens what you resist. Instead, this practice about recognizing a thought the moment it begins to spiral, interrupting its momentum, and replacing it with something deliberate. You are not trying to win a fight against your mind. You are training it, and like any discipline, it starts awkwardly. The interruption feels forced. The awareness comes late. The old patterns seem stronger. But with repetition, something begins to shift. The gap between thought and reaction becomes more visible. The interruptions become quicker. The replacements become more natural. Over time, what once felt like effort becomes instinct. This is the same progression found in martial arts. First you learn the technique, then you repeat it, then you refine it. Eventually, you don't think about it at all, you become it. The goal here is no different. One thought at a time, one interruption at a time, one hiya at a time, until reaction becomes choice. This is the martial art of the mind. Chapter 1. The invisible fight you're already in. Most people imagine conflict as something external, an argument, a setback, a visible challenge that demands a response. But the most constant and influential battles rarely happen out in the open. They happen internally, quietly, and often without being questioned. Long before any action is taken, a thought appears. It might be subtle. I'm not ready. This probably won't work. I'll deal with it later. On their own, these thoughts seem harmless, but they don't stay alone. One thought leads to another, then another, forming a chain reaction that shapes how you feel, how you decide, and ultimately, how you act. This is the invisible fight, and the truth is you are already participating in it. Not occasionally, constantly. Every time you hesitate instead of act, every time you assume the worst, every time you replay a mistake or avoid a responsibility, you are reinforcing a pattern. The mind learns through repetition, not intention. It does not distinguish between what helps you and what holds you back. It simply strengthens what you practice most. If you practice doubt, you become quicker at doubting. If you practice worrying, you become more efficient at worrying. If you practice avoidance, it becomes your default response. Over time, these patterns feel less like habits and more like identity. This is just how I am. But that belief is part of the pattern itself. Because what feels natural is often just what is familiar. The mind is designed to automate. It takes repeated thoughts and compresses them into fast, unconscious reactions. This is useful when learning a physical skill like driving or typing, but it can work against you when the repeated patterns are negative or limiting. You don't stop to analyze every thought. You follow its direction, and that's where the real cost appears. A single negative thought might not matter, but a chain of them can influence an entire decision. It can stop you from starting, 'cause you do quit early, or convince you to avoid something that could have moved your life forward. The fight is not about eliminating thoughts. That's neither possible nor necessary. The fight is about awareness. Because you cannot change what you do not see. Awareness is the first strike, not against the thought itself, but against its invisibility. The moment you notice a thought as it appears, something changes. You are no longer completely inside it. There is now a small distance between you and the reaction that would normally follow. That distance is where control begins. At first, this awareness comes after the fact. You realize you've been stuck in a loop only once it has already affected your mood or your behavior. But even that recognition is a form of progress. It means the pattern is no longer completely automatic. With practice, awareness starts to move earlier. You begin to catch the second or third thought in the chain, then the first. Eventually, you notice the shift in real time. The exact moment a thought begins to pull you in a familiar direction. That moment is critical, because that is where the pattern is weakest. Before the chain builds momentum, before emotion intensifies, before reaction locks in. This is where the training begins, not by fighting harder, not by thinking more, but by seeing clearly. The invisible fight becomes visible, and once you can see it, you are no longer just reacting, you are preparing to act. In the next chapter, you'll learn how to take that moment of awareness and turn it into a decisive interruption, a mental hiya that cuts through the chain before it takes hold. Because awareness opens the door, but action is what changes the outcome. Yeah! Chapter 2. The Hiya Interrupt. Awareness is where change begins, but on its own, it is not enough. You can notice a negative thought and still follow it. You can recognize a pattern and still repeat it. Insight without action keeps the cycle intact. This is where the Hiya Interrupt comes in. The purpose of the interrupt is simple: to break the momentum of a thought before it builds into a chain, not by arguing with it, not by analyzing it, but by cutting it off at the root cleanly and decisively. In martial arts, hesitation creates openings. If you pause mid-movement, you lose control of the exchange. The same principle applies internally. When a thought begins to spiral, every extra second you spend engaging with it gives it more strength, more structure, more influence. The Hiya is not hesitation, it is interruption, a sharp, intentional mental action that says, stop. You are not negotiating with the thought. You are not debating its accuracy. You are not trying to feel better about it. You are ending its momentum. Imagine a piece of wood placed in front of you. If you tap it lightly, nothing happens. If you push against it slowly, it resists. But a focused, committed strike breaks through it in an instant. The Hiya interrupt works the same way. It is not about force, it is about clarity and timing. The moment you notice a thought beginning to pull you into a familiar, negative direction, you apply the interrupt. Internally, this can take the form of a sharp mental cue, Hiya, or even a brief physical anchor like a breath, a posture shift, or a subtle tightening of focus. What matters is not the form. What matters is the decisiveness. The interrupt must be clear enough that it breaks the flow of the thought, It creates a disruption in the pattern, a moment where the automatic chain can no longer continue uninterrupted. At first, this may feel unnatural. You might catch the thought late. You might interrupt weakly. You might immediately slip back into the same pattern. That's part of the training, because what you are building is not perfection, it is interruption speed. Every time you successfully cut a thought, even for a moment, you weaken the automatic pathway that supports it. You are teaching your mind that the pattern is no longer guaranteed to complete itself, and that changes everything. It's important to understand what the Hiya interrupt is not. It is not suppression. You are not pushing the thought down or pretending it doesn't exist. In fact, trying to suppress thoughts often makes them stronger, causing them to return with more intensity. It is also not replacement yet. The interrupt is a separate step. Its only job is to create space. Without that space, any attempt to think positively will feel forced and ineffective, because the original thought is still active underneath. The Hiya comes first. Space comes next. Then direction follows. Think of it like breaking a chain. You don't need to destroy every link, you only need to break one. Once the chain is broken, it no longer holds together. The same is true for thought patterns. You are not responsible for stopping every negative thought from appearing. That is not within your control. What you can control is whether that thought continues, and that decision happens in a moment. A small, precise moment where awareness meets action. That is the Hiya. Over time, this interrupt becomes faster and more natural. What once required effort becomes immediate. The gap between noticing and cutting shrinks until it feels almost simultaneous. You see the thought and it's already broken. This is the beginning of mental discipline, not controlling what appears in your mind, but controlling what is allowed to continue. In the next chapter, you'll learn what to do with the space you've created, because interruption alone is not the end of the practice. It is the opening, and in that opening lies your power. Chapter 3. The space between thought and reaction. After the interrupt, something subtle but powerful appears. Space. It's easy to overlook because it doesn't feel dramatic. There's no loud shift, no instant transformation, just a brief pause, a moment where the thought has been cut, and the automatic reaction has not yet taken its place. Most people rush past this moment without realizing it exists, but this is where your control lives. Before training, thought and reaction feel fused together. A thought appears, and almost instantly, you're inside it, feeling it, believing it, acting from it. There is no visible separation, no point of choice. It feels like a single, continuous experience. The Hiya interrupt breaks that continuity. It creates a gap, and within that gap, something becomes possible that wasn't available before. Deliberate action. This space may only last a second at first, sometimes less, but its length is not what makes it powerful, its presence is, because even the smallest pause disrupts the automatic nature of the pattern. It introduces a question where there used to be none. What do I do next? That question is the beginning of control. In martial arts, timing is everything. The difference between reacting and responding often comes down to a fraction of a second. A skilled practitioner doesn't just move quickly, they move at the right moment, with awareness of what is actually happening, not just what they expect to happen. The same principle applies here. Without space, you react. With space, you can respond. Reaction is fast, familiar, and unconscious. Response is deliberate, chosen, and trained. But this ability does not appear automatically. It must be developed the same way any skill is developed, through repetition. You are training your attention. At first, the space feels unstable. You interrupt the thought, but your mind tries to rush back in. Old patterns attempt to reassemble. The urge to continue the chain is still strong. This is normal, because you are not just creating space, you are learning to hold it. Think of it like building strength in a muscle that has never been used before. The first attempts are shaky. The duration is short. Control feels uncertain. But with consistent practice, that capacity grows. The pause becomes steadier. The mind becomes less reactive. The space becomes more accessible. And something important begins to change. You stop feeling like you are being pulled by your thoughts, and start experiencing yourself as someone who can stand apart from them. Not detached in a cold or distant way, but grounded, present, aware. This is where emotional control actually begins, not by eliminating emotion, but by changing your relationship to the moment before it fully takes over. Because once emotion has fully taken hold, your options narrow, your reactions become predictable. You say things you didn't intend, avoid things you meant to face, or commit to patterns you are trying to break. But in the space before that escalation, your options are still open. You can choose a different direction. This is why the pause is power, not because it feels strong, but because it gives you access to strength. It gives you the ability to act instead of default. And like every part of this practice, it compounds. Each time you create space, you reinforce the pathway that makes it possible. Each time you resist the urge to immediately react, you strengthen your ability to remain steady under pressure. Over time, the gap widens. What was once a split second becomes a clear moment of awareness, a place where you can observe, decide, and act with intention. This is the foundation for everything that follows, because once you have space, you are no longer limited to interruption alone. You can begin to direct. In the next chapter, you'll learn how to challenge the illusion that negative thoughts are solid and unbreakable, and how to see them for what they really are, not permanent structures, but boards waiting to be broken. Chapter 4. Breaking the board of negativity. Negative thoughts often feel solid, not just present but true, fixed, supported by evidence, reinforced by past experiences. When they appear, they don't introduce themselves as opinions. They arrive as conclusions. This is how it is. This is who I am. This isn't going to work. Because of that certainty, they carry weight. They feel like something you have to work around, endure, or accept, like a barrier placed directly in your path. But that solidity is deceptive. In martial arts, breaking a board looks impossible to someone seeing it for the first time. The board appears firm, resistant, unyielding. The mind immediately fills in the conclusion that won't break. And yet, with the right focus, alignment, and commitment, it does. Not because the board was weak, but because its strength was misunderstood. Negative thoughts operate in a similar way. They gain their power not from being inherently true, but from being repeatedly reinforced. Every time a thought is revisited, believed, or followed, it becomes more familiar. And familiarity creates the illusion of permanence. It feels solid because it has been practiced. But practice can be redirected. When you combine the Hiya interrupt with the space you've learned to create, you are no longer facing the thought from inside it. You are now looking at it. That shift matters, because once you can see the thought, you can begin to question its structure, not by overanalyzing it, but by recognizing what it actually is, a constructed pattern, not a fixed reality. Visualization can help here. Imagine the negative thought as a board placed in front of you. It represents a belief, something you've come to accept as a limit. Maybe it's about your ability, your consistency, your worth, or your future. At first glance, it looks solid, but now, instead of stepping back from it or walking around it, you prepare to break through it. Not physically but mentally. The Hiya becomes your strike, not an act of aggression, but an act of clarity. You are not trying to destroy yourself or silence your mind. You are cutting through the assumption that this thought is unchangeable. The key is commitment. A hesitant strike doesn't break the board. Doubt weakens the action before it even lands. In the same way, a half-hearted interrupt one that still secretly believes the thought is in control will struggle to create real change. The shift happens when you stop treating the thought as an authority. It is not a command. It is not a fact. It is a pattern that has been repeated, and patterns can be broken. This doesn't mean the thought will disappear permanently after one interruption. Just like a martial artist doesn't master a technique in a single attempt, you won't dissolve years of repetition instantly. But each time you challenge the thought's solidity, you weaken its structure. You begin to see cracks, moments where the belief doesn't hold as strongly, situations where it doesn't apply as completely as it once did, opportunities where you act differently, even if only slightly. These are not small changes. They are signs that the board is no longer intact. One of the most important realizations in this process is that limits are often perceived, not absolute. The mind builds boundaries based on past repetition, then treats those boundaries as fixed. I always do this. I never follow through. I can't handle that. These statements feel definitive, but they are built from memory, not certainty, and memory can be rewritten through new action. Every time you interrupt a negative thought and refuse to follow its direction, you create a new reference point, a small but real example that contradicts the old pattern. Over time, these moments accumulate. The belief weakens, the certainty fades, the solid board becomes something you no longer hesitate to face. Eventually, you don't just break through individual thoughts. You stop seeing them as barriers in the first place. They become signals, indicators of where your training is needed next. In the next chapter, you'll take the next step, learning how to replace what you've interrupted, because breaking the board creates an opening, but what you build in its place determines what comes next. And that is where transformation begins to take shape. Chapter 5. Replacing, not resisting. Once you've interrupted a thought and created space, there is a natural temptation to stop there, to feel like you've done enough simply by breaking the pattern. But an empty space does not stay empty for long. If nothing new is placed there, the old thought will return, not because you failed, but because the mind is designed to fill gaps. It prefers something familiar over nothing at all, even if that familiar pattern is limiting. This is why interruption alone is not the full practice. What comes next is just as important: replacement. Many people try to deal with negative thoughts by resisting them. They push against them, argue with them, or attempt to suppress them entirely. But resistance has a hidden effect. It keeps your attention locked onto the very thing you're trying to escape. The thought stays active. It lingers in the background, waiting for an opportunity to reappear. What you resist, you continue to engage with. The Hiya Mind takes a different approach. Instead of resisting the thought, you replace it, immediately, deliberately, with direction. This is not about pretending the negative thought never existed. It's about choosing what comes next with intention, rather than allowing the old pattern to reclaim the space you've created. Think of it like stepping off a path you've walked many times. If you simply stop moving, you're still standing on the same ground. But if you take a step in a new direction, even a small one, you begin forming a different route. That first step matters. Replacement works the same way. After the interrupt, you introduce a new thought, a new focus, or a new action that aligns with where you want to go, not where the old pattern was leading you. This doesn't have to be dramatic or overly positive. In fact, forced positivity often backfires because it feels disconnected from reality. If your mind doesn't believe the replacement, it won't hold. Instead, aim for something constructive and believable. If the original thought is, "I'm going to fail," the replacement doesn't need to be, "I'm guaranteed to succeed." It can be, "I can take the next step. I'll focus on what I can control. I've handled difficult things before." The goal is not perfection. The goal is direction. You are guiding your mind toward action, clarity, and forward movement. Another powerful form of replacement is physical action. Sometimes the most effective way to override a thought is not to counter it with another thought, but to move your body in a way that contradicts it. If the thought says, "Avoid this," you begin. If it says, "Wait," you take one step forward. If it says, "You're not ready," you act anyway on a small scale. Action reinforces the new pathway faster than thinking alone. This is how mental training becomes real-world change. It's also important to understand that replacement is not a one-time correction. Just like the original thought pattern was built through repetition, the new pattern requires repetition to take hold. At first, it may feel mechanical. Interrupt, replace, repeat. But over time, the sequence becomes smoother. The replacement begins to appear more naturally, sometimes even before the old thought fully forms. This is when the shift becomes noticeable. You start to default differently. Where you once spiraled, you now stabilize. Where you once avoided, you now engage. Where you once doubted automatically, you now redirect. Not because the old thoughts are gone, but because they no longer control the outcome. You've given your mind a new instruction set. One of the most important aspects of this process is consistency. A single replacement will not outweigh years of repetition, but consistent replacement, applied across moments and situations, gradually rewires the patterns you rely on. It changes what feels natural, and eventually, what once required effort becomes your default response. You no longer have to fight to think differently. You've trained yourself to do it. In the next chapter, you'll learn how to apply this practice at the most important starting point of your day, because the way you begin often determines the patterns that follow, and your first thought is your first opportunity to train. Chapter 6. Morning Discipline. The first Hiya of the day. The first moments of your day are not neutral. Before you speak to anyone, check your phone, or step into your responsibilities, your mind has already begun moving. Thoughts appear quickly, sometimes quietly, sometimes with urgency, and they begin setting a direction. For most people, this process is automatic. You wake up and immediately start thinking about what's ahead, what you didn't finish, what might go wrong, what you don't feel like doing. Without realizing it, you've already entered a pattern, and because it happens so early, it carries momentum into everything that follows. This is why the morning matters, not because it needs to be perfect, but because it is your first opportunity to train. The first Hiya of the day is about interrupting that automatic mental drift before it takes hold. It is a deliberate shift from reacting to directing, before the day has a chance to shape you without your input. When you wake up, there is a brief window where your mind is more impressionable. The thoughts that appear in this space tend to feel especially convincing, not because they are more accurate, but because there is no resistance yet. This is where awareness begins. Instead of immediately following the first thought that arises, you notice it. You observe the tone, the direction, the pull, and then you interrupt. A clear, internal Hiya, not aggressive, not forced, just decisive. You are not rejecting the thought, you are choosing not to let it lead. This moment may feel small, but it changes the starting point of your entire day. Instead of being carried forward by whatever appeared first, you create space, and from that space, you choose your direction. This is where replacement comes in. After the interrupt, you introduce a thought or intention that aligns with how you want to move through the day. Again, this doesn't need to be dramatic or overly ambitious. In fact, simple and clear is more effective. Start steady. Handle what's in front of me, one step at a time. These are not motivational slogans. They are instructions. They give your mind something to organize around. Another powerful element of morning discipline is physical alignment. The state of your body influences the state of your mind. How you sit up, how you breathe, how you move in those first few minutes, all of it reinforces either passivity or intention. You don't need a long routine, but you do need a deliberate one. Sitting up instead of staying collapsed, taking a controlled breath instead of rushing, standing with purpose instead of drifting. These small actions send a signal. The day has begun, and you are participating in it. The goal is not to eliminate all negative thoughts in the morning. That's not realistic, and it's not necessary. The goal is to establish control early, to remind yourself that thoughts can be interrupted, redirected, and replaced before they gain momentum. Because once momentum builds, it becomes harder to shift. Morning discipline reduces that friction. It sets a baseline, and that baseline carries forward. You'll still encounter challenges. You'll still have moments where your mind drifts into old patterns. But the difference is, you've already practiced interruption and direction once. You've already taken control at the starting line. That matters more than it seems. Over time, the first Hiya becomes automatic. You wake up, and instead of immediately being pulled into thought, there is a subtle awareness already in place. A readiness. The gap appears faster. The interrupt happens sooner. The direction becomes clearer. You begin your day trained, not reactive, and that shift compounds, because how you start influences how you continue. In the next chapter, you'll take this practice into one of the most unpredictable environments, conversations with other people where reactions are fast, emotions are involved, and the opportunity to pause becomes even more valuable, because discipline is not just tested in silence, it's tested in interaction. Chapter 7. Conversations as sparring practice. It's one thing to practice control when you're alone. It's another thing entirely when someone else is involved. Conversations are where your training is tested in real time. There is no pause button, no perfect setup, no controlled environment. Words come quickly, reactions rise instantly, emotions can shift in seconds. This is why conversations are not interruptions to your practice. They are your practice. In martial arts, Sparring introduces unpredictability. You can know the technique, understand the form, and still struggle when faced with a live opponent, not because you lack knowledge, but because pressure exposes what is not yet trained. The same is true in communication. You may understand how to interrupt a thought when you are alone, but in a conversation, thoughts don't arrive gently. They show up fast and charged. That was disrespectful. I need to defend myself. They're wrong. I can't let that go. And just like that, the chain begins. Without awareness, reaction follows immediately. Tone changes, words sharpen, you interrupt, withdraw, over-explain, or shut down. Later, you might realize you didn't respond the way you intended, but in the moment, it felt automatic. This is where the Hiya pause becomes essential. Not a visible delay that disrupts the conversation, but an internal interruption, a split-second moment where you cut the automatic reaction before it becomes expression. It happens quickly. You hear something, you feel the reaction begin, and internally -hiya. That's it. A small, precise break in the chain. From the outside, nothing dramatic changes. The conversation continues, but internally, everything is different. Instead of reacting from the first impulse, you've created space, and in that space, you have options. You can choose to listen instead of preparing your defense. You can choose to ask a question instead of making an assumption. You can choose to respond with clarity instead of emotion. This does not mean becoming passive or silent. It means becoming deliberate. There is a difference between holding back and holding control. The Hiya pause gives you that control. It also changes how you perceive the other person. When you're fully inside your reaction, everything they say feels amplified, more personal, more aggressive, more absolute. But when you create space, you begin to hear more accurately. You notice tone without attaching to it. You separate words from assumptions. You recognize that not every statement requires an immediate counter. This reduces unnecessary escalation. Many conflicts are not caused by what is said, but by how quickly both people react to what they think was said, to automatic patterns colliding, each reinforcing the other. The pause breaks that cycle. It slows the exchange just enough for intention to enter. Of course, this is not easy. In fact, conversations may be one of the most challenging places to apply this practice. The emotional charge is real. The stakes can feel high. The desire to react is strong. You will miss moments. You will react before you interrupt. You will say things you wish you hadn't. That's part of the training. Because every conversation, successful or not, gives you feedback. It shows you where your reactions are fastest, where your patterns are strongest, and where your awareness needs to improve. Over time, something begins to shift. The pause becomes quicker. The reactions become less intense. The need to win the moment starts to fade. You become less focused on defending yourself and more focused on directing the interaction. This has a quiet but powerful effect. People respond differently when they are not met with immediate resistance. Conversations become more productive. Tension decreases not because you avoid it, but because you handle it with control. You are no longer sparring to react. You are sparring to train. And just like in martial arts, the goal is not to eliminate challenge, it is to move through it with precision. In the next chapter, you'll expand this practice beyond moments and conversations into the larger arenas of your life, health, money, and responsibility, where patterns don't just appear in seconds, but repeat over days, months, and years. Because discipline is not only built in moments of reaction, it is built in how you show up to your life. Chapter 8. Health, Money, and Responsibility as Dojo. Training does not only happen in moments of pressure or quick reactions. It happens in patterns. The way you take care of your body, the way you manage your finances, the way you handle responsibilities you'd rather avoid. These are not separate areas of life. They are environments, your personal dojo, where your mental discipline is tested repeatedly over time. Unlike a single thought or conversation, these patterns don't unfold in seconds. They build slowly, through daily decisions that seem small in the moment but compound into long-term outcomes. And just like in martial arts, what you do consistently matters more than what you do occasionally. Health, for example, is rarely shaped by one big decision. It's shaped by the quiet choices I'll skip it today. I'll start tomorrow. This isn't a big deal. Each of these thoughts seems minor, easy to justify, but repeated over time, they create a pattern of avoidance. The same applies to money. I'll deal with that later. I don't need to look at it right now. It's too stressful. And responsibility. I don't feel like it. I'll do it when I'm in the mood. I'll wait until I have more energy. These thoughts are familiar because they are practiced, and like any practice pattern, they feel natural even when they lead in the wrong direction. This is where the Hiya Mind extends beyond moments and into lifestyle. You begin to recognize that these areas are not problems to solve once, but training grounds to engage with daily. The same principles apply. Awareness, interrupt, space, replace, act. When a thought appears that encourages avoidance, you see it for what it is, a pattern, not a command. Hiya, you interrupt, you create space, and then you replace it with direction. Not a perfect plan, not a complete transformation, just the next step. For health, that might mean moving your body for 5 minutes instead of doing nothing. For money, it might mean opening the account and looking, even briefly. For responsibility, it might mean starting the task without waiting for motivation. These actions may feel small, but they are not insignificant. They are repetitions, and repetition is what rewires patterns. One of the biggest misconceptions about discipline is that it requires intensity, that you need to feel driven, inspired, or fully committed in order to act. But in reality, discipline is built through consistency, not intensity. Small, repeated actions outweigh occasional bursts of effort. This is where many people get stuck. They wait until they feel ready to engage with important areas of their life. But that feeling is unreliable. It comes and goes, often influenced by the very patterns they are trying to break. The Hiya Mind removes that dependency. You don't wait to feel like acting. You interrupt the thought that tells you not to, and then you act anyway at a level you can sustain. Over time, this changes your relationship with responsibility. What once felt heavy becomes manageable. What once triggered avoidance becomes a signal to engage. What once required effort becomes routine. You begin to see these areas not as burdens, but as opportunities to train. Your health becomes a place to practice consistency. Your finances become a place to practice awareness. Your responsibilities become a place to practice follow-through. This shift is subtle, but it is powerful, because it moves you from a mindset of resistance to one of participation. You are no longer trying to escape the work. You are using it, and as you continue, something important happens. Your identity begins to change. You stop seeing yourself as someone who avoids, delays, or struggles to stay consistent. You start seeing yourself as someone who shows up, not perfectly, not effortlessly, but repeatedly. And that repetition builds trust not just in the process, but in yourself. In the next chapter, you'll confront one of the most common obstacles to consistency, the belief that motivation must come before action. Because if you wait to feel ready, you'll always be waiting. But if you learn to act first, something else begins to follow. Chapter 9. Motivation is not a feeling, it's a strike. One of the most persistent misunderstandings about change is the belief that motivation comes first, that you wait for it, that you find it, that you need to feel it before you can begin. This belief is comfortable because it puts action in the hands of emotion. If you don't act, it's because you didn't feel motivated. If you delay, it's because the feeling wasn't there yet. But in practice, this reverses how momentum actually works. Motivation is not the starting point, it is the result. In martial arts, no one waits to feel ready before throwing a strike. Readiness is built through movement. The body learns through repetition, not intention. The mind follows what the body consistently does. The same principle applies here. Action creates momentum. Momentum creates clarity. Clarity produces what people label as motivation, but it begins with movement, not feeling. The Hiya Mind reframes motivation entirely. Instead of treating it as an emotional state you must achieve, it treats it as an action you generate. A strike, not physical aggression, but a mental decision to move despite resistance. The moment you notice hesitation, Hiya, not later, not after convincing yourself, not after negotiating with the discomfort. Now, that interruption is the strike against inertia, because inertia is what most people are actually facing, not lack of motivation. It's the tendency to stay where you are mentally and physically because movement requires a break from comfort. The mind offers reasons. You're not ready? You'll do it later. Wait until you feel better. These thoughts are not facts. They are friction, and friction feels like resistance, which the mind often interprets as a signal to stop. But in training, resistance is not a stop sign, it is the beginning of engagement. The strike of Hiya cuts through that friction. It interrupts the narrative that says you must feel ready before acting. Then comes the most important part: immediate action. Not perfect action, not complete action, not optimized action, just action. If you are avoiding a task, you begin it for 2 minutes. If you are delaying movement, you stand up and start. If you are overthinking, you do one small step that breaks the loop. The purpose is not completion, it is activation. Because once movement begins, something shifts internally. The resistance that felt solid begins to weaken. The mind, which was previously generating reasons to delay, starts adjusting to the fact that action is already happening. This is where momentum forms. And momentum is what people mistakenly call motivation. It is easier to act once you are already in motion, much harder to start from stillness. That is why the first strike matters most. Every time you act without waiting for motivation, you weaken the belief that motivation is required. You teach your mind a new sequence. Thought gives Hiya, gives action, gives clarity. Instead of thought gives delay, gives justification, gives inaction. Over time, the second pattern loses influence, not because it disappears completely, but because it stops being the default. You begin to notice something subtle but important. You are less dependent on emotional states to begin. You don't need to feel like it to start. You start, and the feeling follows. This is where discipline becomes real, not in forcing yourself endlessly, but in reducing the distance between intention and action until there is almost none. Of course, this does not mean every moment becomes easy. Resistance still appears. Hesitation still arises. The difference is that it no longer dictates behavior. You no longer wait inside it. You move through it. And each time you do, you reinforce a different identity, not someone who waits for motivation, but someone who generates it through action. Not someone who feels ready, but someone who strikes first. In the final chapter, you'll see how all of this training converges not into constant effort, but into something quieter and more natural, a state where the interrupt, the space, and the response become part of who you are, rather than something you practice. Not fighting the mind, but mastering the direction of it. Chapter 10. Mastering the mental form. At the beginning of any martial art, everything feels deliberate. Stances must be remembered. Movements must be corrected. Timing must be thought through step by step. Nothing is automatic. You are not yet a practitioner in the full sense. You are a student repeating form, building awareness through effort. But over time, repetition changes the nature of the practice itself. What once required intense focus begins to flow more naturally. The body stops negotiating with every movement. The mind no longer has to supervise every detail. Instead, technique starts to organize itself in the background of awareness. This is the transition from effort to embodiment. The same process applies to the mind. At first, the Hiya interrupt is deliberate. You notice a thought. You catch yourself. You apply the interruption. You create space. And you consciously choose a replacement. Each step is visible. Each step requires attention. It feels like training because it is training. But with repetition, something shifts. The sequence shortens. Awareness arrives earlier. The interrupt becomes quicker. The space becomes more accessible. The replacement becomes more natural. What once felt like separate steps begins to merge into one continuous response. You no longer think through the process, you enter it. This is the mental form. In martial arts, a form kata is not just a series of movements. It is a structure designed to be repeated until it no longer needs to be consciously assembled. Through repetition, the practitioner internalizes timing, balance, focus, and flow. Eventually, the form disappears as practice and becomes expression. The Hiya Mind follows the same path. At first, you are working with tools. Interrupt, space, replace, act. Later, those tools begin to work through you. A negative thought appears, but there is no spiral. Not because it was fought, but because it does not gain traction. A moment of hesitation arises, but it is cut instantly, without drama. A familiar pattern tries to form, but it dissolves before it completes itself. This is not suppression. It is mastery of direction. You are no longer trying to control every thought. You are training the system that responds to thoughts. And when that system is trained, the experience of mental life changes. There is less internal struggle, not because challenges disappear, but because they no longer escalate into chains. Thoughts still arise, but they lose their authority. They become signals, not commands. You begin to recognize a simple truth. You are not the thoughts that appear. You are the one who trains the response to them. This distinction changes everything, because identity is not built from isolated moments. It is built from repeated responses. If you repeatedly follow hesitation, you become someone who hesitates. If you repeatedly follow doubt, you become someone who doubts. If you repeatedly interrupt and redirect, you become someone who directs. Repetition is not just behavior, it is formation. And once the mental form is established, discipline stops feeling like effort and starts feeling like structure. You are no longer constantly deciding whether to engage. You are already engaged by default. This does not mean life becomes effortless or that negative thoughts stop appearing. It means they no longer define the outcome of your internal state. There is a difference between thoughts existing and thoughts leading. In mastery, thoughts exist, but they do not lead without permission. The Hiya Mind becomes less of a technique and more of a baseline orientation, a way of meeting experience that is steady, responsive, and intentional, not reactive, not resistant, directed. And in that direction, something quiet emerges, clarity, not as a constant emotional state, but as a reliable return point. No matter what arises, you know how to re-enter it. You know how to interrupt, create space, and choose your next action. That is the real end of training, not perfection, but accessibility. You can return to it at any time, and over time, even that return becomes unnecessary, because the interruption is already there. The space is already present. The response is already aligned. Not someone who fights thoughts, not someone who is controlled by them, but someone who directs them naturally, consistently, and without effort. This is the quiet mastery of the mental form. Conclusion: the quiet mastery. The aim was never to quiet your mind completely. It was never about erasing every negative thought, dissolving all doubt, or reaching a place where struggle disappears. Chasing that would only create another kind of tension and endless attempt to fix something that was never meant to vanish. Thoughts will still show up, patterns will still try to repeat. Old tendencies will resurface from time to time. None of that is the problem. What matters is what follows. In the early stages, the Hiya Mind feels intentional. You catch a thought, disrupt it, create a pause, and consciously decide how to respond. It can feel methodical, even slow at times. You are retraining something that has operated on autopilot for years. But with repetition, that process evolves. The interruption sharpens. The pause becomes more accessible. The shift feels more fluid. The response grows more natural. What once took effort begins to unfold with ease. Not because life has softened, but because your relationship with your thoughts has transformed. You are no longer absorbed in every thought. You are no longer pulled along by every reaction. There is a return point now, a subtle moment of awareness where you can regain direction. Then, over time, something deeper settles in. The practice no longer feels like something you do. The Hiya is no longer a step, the interruption in a technique. The space isn't something you have to force open. It becomes your default, not driven by effort, but built into how you function. This is what makes it lasting. Not intensity or constant effort, but repetition until the pattern reshapes itself. And when that shift takes hold, you stop seeing yourself as someone trying to manage your thoughts. You experience yourself as someone who guides them. It may sound like a small distinction, but it changes everything. The inner conflict fades. You're no longer battling your mind or trying to escape it. You're working with it, influencing it in real time. Challenges don't disappear, but your automatic reactions no longer define them. You begin to notice something steady and reliable. The space between what happens and how you respond is always there. It might feel brief, it might feel distant, but it exists. And within that space, you remain free. Free to interrupt, free to decide, free to redirect. This is the essence of the Hiya Mind, not forceful control, but trained clarity, not perfection, but intention, not resistance to thought, but a refined relationship with it. In the end, there's nothing to conquer, only something to live out, and once it becomes part of you, it no longer feels like an action. It feels like who you are,